All right, folks, fashionably late as always. Mr. Lassiter here with you. And we are going to be reviewing for our period 6 test today. So very excited to get started back on YouTube today, doing a little review. And we will answer your questions. Nothing really planned on my behalf. I will endeavor to answer your questions as you present them. So let me just get a check in the chat. If you can hear what's going on, you can hear what I'm saying, let me know, just to make sure that audio is all okay. You will find that my air conditioner is running in the back. So it was about 80 degrees up here when I got started. So that'll be kicking on from time to time. Hopefully it's not too distracting in the background. So overall, we want to focus this this live review on, well, per usual, the things that are most helpful to you. What do you want to know? So we can go ahead and get started. Only got about 10 going right now, so get your questions in. Hopefully they will be answered. Perhaps my period 6 review packet was so good that people are not too worried about our test tomorrow. So let's get started. The first thing to think about with this unit, I think, while you're thinking about questions or populating questions, it might be a very short night if there are no questions. I can just go over some basics. First thing that I want us to think about is what this time period covers, right? So it's 1900 to present. 1900, the date makes sense. It's the beginning of the 20th century, this new era, new paradigms in thinking, new types of warfare. But really, at the start of this era, remember that we are seeing a continuation of what had been occurring in the 19th century, mainly thinking about European imperialism, right? That well, even beyond European, U.S. imperialism too, that really comes to define the beginning of the 20th century and leads us into World War I. This time period is also characterized by intense global conflict, which we see in both world wars and in the Cold War, and in all the proxy wars that are fought via the Cold War, all the side wars and civil wars, and especially in the developing world that we see in this time period. So that comes to define this era as well. Rapid advancements in technology and science alter our understanding of the world around us. That led to the development of even newer technologies, right? Watching this on the internet, that makes a lot of sense. Technological developments also allow unprecedented population growth. Excuse me. And that, of course, changed how we interact with our environment. This time period also thinks about, or if we're continuing to think about trends in this time period, beyond just global conflict and technology, keep in mind that our world changes the way we view existing states. The existing political orders are challenged. We see post-World War II decolonization take place. That is a trend that really started before World War II. You can look at a place like South Asia or India for that. And a movement toward free and independent states and self-government in the world. And that looked very different depending on where we're talking about. And then, of course, we see as kind of our last trend, new economic paradigms, new economic challenges in this time period, new economic, for example, like the growth of free trade, especially after World War II. In some cases in this time period, we see governments more involved than ever before in their economies. In some places, we see hands-off economies or more laissez-faire. We see unprecedented global economic meltdowns. And all of that is because of this trend of growing integration in the world, especially of its economies. This process known as globalization, and that is aided even by the growth of global organizations like the United Nations, World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and regional trade agreements like NAFTA, or eventually the European Union. So all of these are kind of at play in this time period. So certainly, all of these changes in this globalization are also going to have an impact on culture, and education, and health, and the list goes on and on. So that's kind of my introduction to this. If anybody who is not my student is watching this now or later on, I just really want to emphasize that as you get closer to the AP exam, that is May 16th, I want to say, whatever that Thursday is, the week of the 16th. I do have a playlist, videos, review packets available for you. So take a look at those. That gives you tons of really great information to prepare you for the test. That said, I think, sorry, excuse my cough, allergies, I guess, is still causing this. Yeah, let's get into your questions. They're starting to populate. So let's see. Looking at the chat, I can see that some people were upset we started 5 minutes early. Whatever. All right. So first thing people want to talk about is the India-Pakistan split. Great question. Great topic to think about. India, or South Asia, I guess, as we would use more specifically or less specifically in this time period, is an important thing to understand. Going back to our last time period 5, they were under British control. If you recall, the British Raj was started, or the direct rule of the British Crown over India, the British reign, or Raj, in South Asia, began after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, or the Sepoy Rebellion, as it's also known. And so Britain has direct control over South Asia from that time all the way until the 1940s. That said, the British, in establishing control, built infrastructure in India, brought the English language, brought Western education to India. And all of those tools connected the disparate regions of India together, giving them an identity which really they did not have before, did not have in, or had sparingly before, perhaps in a few empires here and there. But really, these kind of wide-ranging, varied ethnic groups of people with many different languages and different ideas of Hinduism, or different beliefs with Islam and Hinduism and Sikhism and many other religions, they start to form a national identity, really, ironically, aided by the British. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, the Indian National Congress forms, also later the All India Muslim League. These are the organizations led by people like Mohandas Gandhi for the Indian National Congress, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah for the Muslim League in India. They form and begin pushing for Indian independence. That begins long before India gets its independence, actually. They send people to fight in World War I, for example, and they support Britain in that Great War. But it is not until after World War II that they finally achieve independence. And that's through a concerted effort of the Indian National Congress, the INC, and the Muslim League, together pushing for independence. Especially noteworthy in that is Mohandas Gandhi and his use of nonviolent resistance against the British. Some of the more important things to keep in mind with him, he used a lot of hunger strikes. He went on his salt march to the sea. The British made it illegal for Indians to make their own salt, and they had to pay a tax on salt. Gandhi also spun his own thread and wove his own clothing, which the British had not allowed. So those acts of nonviolence, as well as the push from these groups and the massive amount of support they garnered, eventually led to the British granting South Asia its independence. However, most of South Asia was Hindu, although there was a great tradition of Islam in South Asia, specifically the northern regions, especially regions where the Delhi Sultanate had ruled, and later on the Mughal Empire, probably more significantly, the Mughal Empire had ruled in India. And the minority population of Muslims did not want to live under a Hindu government. And so this is where Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Mohandas Gandhi really split, in Gandhi wanting a united government that would serve all South Asians, and Jinnah wanting a Muslim-led government. Britain really just didn't handle this very well. Eventually, they did agree to the partition of India into two states. That was India, which would be majority Hindu, and Pakistan, which would be majority Muslim. And Pakistan consisted of two portions, Pakistan as we call it now, and East Pakistan, which is now known as Bangladesh, which later split from Pakistan. And that is how that partition happened between India and Pakistan. What resulted was the displacement of millions of people, Muslims who did not want to live under Hindu rule, moving into Pakistan, Hindus who did not want to live under Muslim rule, moving from Pakistan to India. And in that displacement, in that migration, and conflicts broke out between the two sides. Also, India and Pakistan had a major dispute over certain territories along their border, most significantly the region of Kashmir, which is still the site of tension between India and Pakistan to this day. There is no actual defined border, and every once in a while they exchange fire on either side. That actually, I think, was in the news a couple months ago. Something similar resulting from that after, I think, an airplane was shot down. So that's kind of the brief overview of India and eventually the India-Pakistani split. It's something that you could probably expect to see on your exam for sure. So great question, Jaquan. Can we go over China throughout time period 6? Most certainly. That's a great next question. So let's take a look and let's think about what China looked like at the beginning of this time period and what it looks like today. Again, we have to reach back into the 19th century, right? We got to reach back into the end of the 1800s to think about where China is when it begins the 1900s. So in the 1800s, in the 30s, in the 1800s sometime. Remember that European countries had a massive trade deficit to China. Before the 1800s, even further back, China had no use for European goods. They wanted to keep European influence out of China. Instead, they traded everything that Europeans wanted: tea, porcelain, whatever it might be, silk, if they wanted silk from China. They were basically taking European funds and trading away whatever Europeans wanted, but not really buying anything from the Europeans themselves. The Chinese had no use for that. Britain especially understood that this trade deficit was not good for them from an economic standpoint. And so they looked for the product that they thought could balance that trade deficit. And lucky for them, in nearby India and Burma and Afghanistan, they were growing massive amounts of opium. Opium is a highly addictive drug. It's the basis for heroin and for the opiates. And you may have heard about the opioid crisis, or the crisis that we're, of course, dealing with in the modern world today in the United States, prescription drug crisis. The British decide that they're going to sell opium in China, and they become very successful at this, smuggling this drug in. Massive amounts of people become addicted to this drug, including the emperor, who even tries it. But the Chinese government tries to put a stop to this. At one point, I think it was something like 1 in every 4 men had tried opium or was addicted to opium. It was just a massive problem in China. It was blamed for the breakdown of Confucian values and a breakdown of the family and a breakdown of their economic system and a general weakening of the government as well. So Britain, of course, fights. The Chinese government tries to shut this down. They basically tell Britain, you can't sell it anymore. They even confiscate this like large shipload of these drugs. Britain's not too happy about that. So the Opium Wars are fought, and Britain takes just kicks China's butt in this war. They're way more advanced than China. For a number of reasons, this, of course, leads to chaos in China, right? There's people thinking that the government, the Qing dynasty at the time, has lost its mandate of heaven, and certainly that leads to rebellions. It leads to the Taiping Rebellion, which the British and French have to help defeat. It leads to the Boxer Rebellion, which the government tacitly supported, trying to force European influences out of China. And by the end of the 1800s, basically what you have are spheres of influence in China. The United States has a region, France and Great Britain and Germany and all these major powers basically have ports where they do business in China, and they can sell their goods to China and vice versa. Well, what does that mean for the government? The government is weak. It is beginning to crumble, and ultimately, the government of China, the empire, the Qing Empire, falls, and it disintegrates. It gives up power, and the nationalists of China end up coming to power. First, I think, led by Sun Yat-sen, and then later by Chiang Kai-shek. So they rise to power. I want to give the date as 1912, but somebody can fact check me there on the date the Qing dynasty actually falls. I should probably check that myself before going any further. 1912, which I think is the Titanic sink, but that's not relevant to this class. Anyway, so the Qing dynasty falls. The Republic of China is formed. It is a nationalist government, and it will control China for some time. However, following the Russian Revolution to China's northwest, many people in China start to turn toward another type of government that they think might best serve the people, and that is communism. And so what we see is a communist party form in China. The nationalist government begin to crack down on this, and a war break out between the nationalist government that is eventually led by Chiang Kai-shek and a communist movement, a communist entity led by eventually Mao Zedong. The government tries to stamp out the communists, and Mao Zedong takes these communists on his famous Long March into the mountains of China. But this kind of back and forth between the government of China, the nationalist government, and the communists has to take a hiatus because Japan, to China's east, is growing quickly, right? They're undertaking imperial expansion, and they, in the 1930s, begin a war with China, taking over large portions of it, really kicking off what will eventually become incorporated into World War II. Now, I'm not going to go too much into World War II in China, because that would mean having to talk about the entirety of the Pacific, and that's just not really what we need to talk about today. But at the end of the war, once Japan is defeated by the Allies, led by the United States, China is granted its freedom. And then in that time during the war, the Nationalist Party had begun losing the faith of the Chinese people. They were seen as very weak and complacent compared to the Japanese, whereas Mao Zedong and his communists had actually fought rather valiantly against the Japanese and had garnered a lot of public support, especially among the peasants. Mao Zedong even recast communism not as an urban working class rising up against the government and seizing the means of production, but he had recast it as a peasant rebellion or a peasant movement. And so the peasants of China were very much in support. And so once World War II kind of finishes and Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek are no longer dealing with Japan, they can then deal with each other. And the civil war in China basically continues right after its cliffhanger season break. It comes back, and ultimately the winners of that, of course, are the Communist Chinese and Mao Zedong. Once in control of China, beginning in the 1940s or so, the government of China under Mao Zedong undertakes many different reforms in creating this communist state. And the two of these reforms that are best known under the communist government of Mao Zedong in the People's Republic of China are the Cultural Revolution, which were akin to Stalin's purges, but also a process of a period of collectivization known as the Great Leap Forward. And the Great Leap Forward is really one of like the biggest man-made disasters in human history. During that Great Leap Forward, as it was called, Mao Zedong aimed to rapidly transform his country from an agrarian economy into a socialist society. And he was going to do that in much the same way that Stalin tried to, through industrialization and collectivization, the collectivization of agriculture. That ultimately resulted in millions of deaths from famine, as the collectivization of agriculture was a complete disaster in China. Now, Mao Zedong almost lost support during this time, but he eventually weathers that storm and continues to rule in China. Really, the next phase of Chinese history to kind of think about in the 20th century, in the 1900s, is really what comes in the 1980s, right? Thinking about China from a country of maybe peasant farmers and this communist country to modern day kind of power. I also need to actually back up a little bit. This is in my head when I said the Cultural Revolution first. It really was out of order. The Great Leap Forward occurs beginning in the 1950s into the 1960s. And that's generally a failure. Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution really begins in the late 1960s to reconsolidate his power when he feels like he's losing it. And it's akin to the purges. Basically, in the Cultural Revolution, Mao roots out anyone who he believes is opposing him and really wants to kind of reimpose his power as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Anyways, so let's fast forward to the 1980s. By that time, the United States and Communist China there had entered kind of in the 70s under Nixon, a period of détente. American president had actually gone to China, and Mao's Deng Xiaoping comes to power in the 1980s as leader of the Communist Party in China, and he undertakes his own series of reforms, but these reforms are very different from Mao's reforms. Basically, the reforms of Deng Xiaoping see far-reaching market economy reforms. He basically introduces a lot of free market economics. He introduces a lot of more capitalist, you can say, more capitalist aspects into the Chinese economy in what are called special economic zones within China. So he really relegates it to just certain regions of China. And this opens up China to the massive growth that it has had since the 1980s. These reforms really brought China into the global economy rather than being kind of separated off. And it has really led to China being the behemoth it is today in the global economy as a massive market for goods produced around the world, including, like, for example, movies made here in the United States that are marketed in China. but also a major producer, right? The iPhone that you probably have in your pocket, largely produced in this region of the world. So that is a brief history of China in the 20th century and a little bit of the 19th century too. All right. Thanks for the question, Gabby. That is what I eventually got to. So I hope I answered it. Rowan asks, how much do we need to know about military tactics? Ooh, good question. Not too much. You do need to know about new military tactics in especially World Wars I and II. So the key concepts does deal with this. It kind of goes hand in hand with new technologies, new military technologies. And ultimately, you need to know that those new technologies and new tactics led to the waging of total warfare. And what we end up seeing is an increase in the total wartime casualties. So in World War I, of course, it's like trench warfare, the use of machine guns, the use of like U-boats and things that had never really been seen before. In World War II, it's tanks and airplanes and incendiary bombs or fire bombs, certainly nuclear bombs as well, and indiscriminate what's called total war, which brought the war not just to the men on the front lines, but to all citizens of a country who were deemed to be engaged in the war effort. Right, the United States targeted, for example, in Germany and Japan with bombings, industrial centers that were engaged in wartime production. Because if civilians were building airplanes or building bombs, that means they were part of the war effort and they were fair game. So those are some tactics to think about. I think beyond World Wars I and II, the increased use of guerrilla warfare, and not GOR, ILLA warfare, but GUER, guerrilla warfare, with maybe less organized, no front line tactics, that has persisted really in the second half of the 20th century, especially in dealing with modern wars, especially in like places like Vietnam or Afghanistan. Those tactics are much more prevalent now, especially in countries where there may not be a single national military entity. That's probably the extent of military tactics that you might need to know. Gabby asks, is the Boer War, BOER, war within this time period, or was that last time period? That was our last time period. In South Africa, the Boer War is fought in well, there are several Boer Wars, but in the late 19th century. So that's when we dealt with that. We did not deal with it too much in this time period. The first Boer War, I think, was around 1890. The second one right at the end, turn of the century. Can you go over the different parties that rose and fell in China, and when did they do so? I think I may have answered that question already, Sarah, in kind of talking generally about China. But really, after the fall of the Qing Empire, you just need to know the nationalists who were responsible for the Republic of China and the Communist Party in China, which was the leaders of what's called now the People's Republic of China, but they were the party of Mao Zedong. The Nationalist Party, that made up the Republic of China, was eventually forced off the mainland to Thailand, and that was the party that was officially recognized by the United States for a long time as the true government of China. But we all know who the government of China is. It's the one that's in charge of mainland China, and so. Hopefully I answered your question in kind of my long diatribe on China. Can we go over the difference between Yalta and Potsdam Conference? Excuse me. Yes, I'm going to go to the AMSCO book to make this short and hopefully sweet. So what this is in reference to when we think about the Yalta and Potsdam Conference is the end of World War II. And unlike World War I, where we see like all these countries get together at Versailles and they're like, we want this and we want this and we want this, and they all have different ideas. The Allies, especially the big three, the United States, Britain, and Russia, led by Churchill, Stalin, and Franklin Roosevelt, though not in the same order that I gave countries, but the leaders of those countries, they began thinking about what they wanted the world to look like even before this war was over. In fact, Franklin Delano Roosevelt met with Winston Churchill before the United States was even involved in the war. And they, in the Atlantic Charter, laid out the world that they would like to see after the Second World War ended. This is, a good way to think about, how maybe you should go about studying, right? You don't want to just study instead aimlessly. You need to have end goals. And so, of course, those don't always end up perfectly. Maybe that's a bad explanation because, well, after all, the Cold War did eventually come about. But the Yalta and Potsdam conferences mainly dealt with these major powers meeting together to decide what the world would look like. The Yalta Conference was in February of 1945, which is what I had to look up here. And there we start to see cracks in that alliance between the Soviets and the Americans, right? They realize that they have very different goals. The United States and Franklin Roosevelt really insist on free and democratic elections in Eastern Europe, or really throughout Europe after the war is over. And Stalin shows his resistance to that. However, Stalin does agree, technically, to join the war against Japan once the war in Europe is over, if Soviet Union gets some concessions. Basically, Franklin Roosevelt agrees with a lot of what Russia wants, because he's really holding out hope that the Soviet Union will allow free elections in Europe. That will not happen. At Potsdam, it's a very different conference, because by that time, Franklin Roosevelt has died in office and President Truman has become the president. Even Winston Churchill, by the end of that conference, is recalled. He has to go home because of elections in England, and he's replaced with Clement Attlee as prime minister. And by that conference, which began in July of 1945, the war in Europe had come to an end. So the Soviet Union had occupied Eastern Europe, and they were not going to give it up, nor were they going to allow free elections in Eastern Europe. I think Stalin said something to the effect of that free elections in Eastern Europe would be decidedly anti-Soviet, and that they could not allow. They needed that buffer, they believed, between them and the Western Europe. Basically, that the Potsdam Conference and kind of the lack of trust between the two countries there really set the stage for the Cold War. The United States also informs Russia sometime around there that they have a weapon of mass destruction or unparalleled destruction. Stalin knows that we've developed a nuclear bomb. We just don't tell him, and that kind of leads to further mistrust between the countries. The Soviet Union, however, does declare war on Japan after the United States has already dropped an atomic bomb, but before Japan surrenders. So they got to sit down at the peace conference dealing with Japan, although they did not get much out of it. All right, let's keep moving. Can we overview Wilson's 14 points and the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles? Certainly. I know we're jumping around time-wise, but hopefully it's not too confusing for you. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Good question. Now, let me just say right off the bat that you don't need to know all of Wilson's 14 points. But what I would say that you need to know is what we mean by the term perhaps Wilsonian, or like a Wilsonian vision for the world. And a lot of that really has to do with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. How did he view international relations in the world, or how did he think that internationalism should look in the 20th century. And Woodrow Wilson really lays out this view with his 14 points. Ultimately, they certainly want peace. He was known for saying peace without victory. He wanted to make sure there were no hidden or no secret treaties, that all treaties were made in public so that people would not be dragged into a war. He wanted greater freedom of trade. He wanted to adjust colonial boundaries as well at the end of World War One. And so he makes a lot of demands about territorial issues, about who should give up what land, how it should be partitioned. But above all, with this like redrawing of boundaries in his 14 points, he wants to create nation states with self-determination. That means countries that are nations in the classical sense, these different ethnic groups having self-rule, having autonomy over themselves, and being able to choose for themselves their own government. He gets that to an extent. Some nation states are created. Austria and Hungary are split apart into two separate states. However, there's no like individual there, in the long term, you have like a multinational state like Yugoslavia created. Instead of a Czech state and a Slovak state, you have Czechoslovakia created as one country following World War I. Again, we're talking about Woodrow Wilson here, so World War I. His last point, and probably his most important because of its, maybe not in terms of its success after World War I, but perhaps later on, is that Woodrow Wilson wanted an association of nations formed to try to keep peace and represent the interests of big and small states alike. He called that the League of Nations. So basically, he calls for the creation of the League of Nations, which is created, although not with his vision. Germany, for example, is not allowed to join right away. Russia's never allowed to join. But the United States isn't necessarily ready for that vision of Wilson's international world. We still are a country that felt like we had to get involved in World War I. We would prefer to be not involved with European entanglements. And so the United States Congress never approves it. The U.S. never joins the League of Nations. However, the League of Nations certainly is the precursor to the United Nations, which was an agreement made between the major powers in World War II to create that United Nations that would involve both the United States and Soviet Union. Now, in terms of the Treaty of Versailles, some major things to know. One, it sucked. It didn't do a good job, but it blamed Germany for World War I, rightly or wrongly. Probably wrongly, as everyone was at fault. Germany lost a great deal of land as well as their military. They were very restricted. They were forced to demilitarize. There was a demilitarized zone established between France and Germany in the Rhineland. And Germany had to pay massive reparations to the rest of Europe. The Treaty of Versailles also led to the Ottoman Empire eventually being broken up, the Austro-Hungarian Empire being broken up, and the establishment of mandates in the Middle East, where England and France predominantly controlled large areas of land there. The Treaty of Versailles ultimately was seen as pretty punitive. It was a punishment for Germany, and so that was used as a rallying cry for Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party as they sought to undo what they saw as the unjust Treaty of Versailles. Some of the things that Hitler and the Nazis did was, of course, demand territory back, build up a military. They stopped paying reparations to other European countries. And European countries, for the most part, just kind of appeased them. All right, just don't start a war. Don't start a war. Don't start a war. Of course, part of the goal of that Nazi fascism was to grow its territory, and that ultimately resulted in war. All right. Next question. Can we review the Mexican Revolution? Sure. So the Mexican Revolution is something I used to teach in a lot of detail. We use this old book by a guy named Bulliet, and it was yeah, I used to spend like 2 days on it, and that's just probably too much nowadays. So let me just generally talk about the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution, which is sometimes known as the Mexican Civil War, was basically an armed conflict between about 1910 and 1920. And it was generally kind of seen as a national revolution that sought to gain greater rights and even the redistribution of land to support the peasantry of Mexico. It was really kind of breaks out. There's like a presidential crisis and some political problems, but ultimately it is like a groundswell from the peasant class in Mexico that want greater rights. It happens in several phases. Ultimately, you know, I don't want to go too much into the details because I know, one, that you're not going to be asked those details on the test, on the AP exam or my exam. But it does last, armed conflict lasts about a decade or so. It really changes from a result, a revolt aimed at just like changes in politics, and really transforms into one like looking for constitutional reform. It kills something around the neighborhood of like 1 million people in total. Ultimately there is like push for land reform, push for a new constitution in Mexico, which does come, but it never really gets the extent of the constitutional reform and the rights for the lower classes that people looked for. Let me see if I'm missing any of the big stuff. It's hard. It's been so many years since I've taught it. I'm blanking on the names of. There's Pancho Villa is one of the big guys, and Zapata, I think. But I keep blanking on some of the specifics of it. Let me make sure I've just got the results. That's the most important thing. All right. Make sure I got this. Or maybe I'm getting, yeah, Zapata. So I'm using the AMSCO book here to help me out with this. So you can see that even I have to look some stuff up. So this is a good stumper. Yeah, so 97% of the land in Mexico controlled by the wealthiest 1% of the population. There's a push for redistribution of land, support for the peasants. One revolutionary leader actually begins to redistribute this land. And there are the goals of land redistribution. This is the term I was looking for when I kept saying constitutional reforms. Universal suffrage, so that people, allowing all people in Mexico to vote. That was one thing they were looking for. And public education. Those were the goals. They were not realized right away. They were written into the Mexican Constitution that is passed in 1917. Later on in the 1930s, there is greater redistribution of land. And that happens under a guy named Cardenas, Lázaro Cárdenas. And as leader of Mexico, he does a couple things. One, redistribution of land, but two, the second thing is something that really we've talked about in class. I've mentioned in class, I know, and it's kind of seen as like anti-imperialist or, you know, fighting back against neocolonialism. Cardenas nationalized the oil industry in Mexico, which was particularly important because most of the oil industry had a lot of foreign investors, including those in the United States. And by nationalizing that industry, he took over that and made it run by the Mexican government. And that can be seen perhaps as as a result of these pushes for greater equality across Mexico. That said, there were these constitutional reforms. There was some land reform, nationalization of the oil industry and the like. The social hierarchy in Mexico, though, does not change greatly. There's still large gaps there between the rich and the poor, even after all of those things. So, anyways, I hope that started to answer your question in dealing with the Mexican Revolution. I think you may have that as part of one of your readings that I gave you from the AMSCO book. Otherwise, it'll be in your textbook. All right. The Mexican Revolution is mentioned in the key concepts too. I guess I should say that. It comes up in, let me see if I can find it. I have my key concepts up always while I am doing one of these. Let me find it. Yes, so this is in Key Concept 6.2. It talks about anti-imperialism, and the key concepts say the Mexican Revolution arose in opposition to neocolonialism and economic imperialism, and movements to redistribute land and resources developed within Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And of course, the Mexican Revolution also sought to redistribute land and resources. So that's where you'll find it. That's how it kind of fits into the themes of the course. Another question, can we talk about the Iranian Revolution and its outcomes? Yes, actually, I think I assigned a reading about that. So I would point you mainly to the AMSCO reading that you were given for my class. The Iranian Revolution, I also had some slides on that I might have shared in Google Classroom. Let me see if I can pull it up here. I don't know if I can share the screen with you here. Let's see if I can figure out how to do that. Broadcast, screen share. Let's see. If I can pull this up, I will share the screen with you and just kind of give you a brief rundown. Basically, the Iranian Revolution that we think about in this class is a conservative Muslim revolution that seeks to remove Western influences within Iran. Now, Iran had never been truly taken over by Western powers, although Britain and okay, I think I can figure out how to do this. Application, nope, wrong one. All right, share. All right, now we're gonna have like a really weird thing going on here. This gives you some info on the Iranian Revolution here. I hope that's working for you. Iran had been under the influence of Britain and Russia, who both kind of like fought for control over Persia in the 19th century. It was called the Great Game. In the 1920s, a guy named Reza Khan seizes power. He declares himself Shah, or ruler of Iran. He undertakes a lot of modernization aspects. He abolishes extraterritoriality, which is pretty important, modernizes the infrastructure, curbs the power of a lot of like the Muslim leaders. But during World War II, Iran was eventually invaded by Russia and Britain, and eventually Shah Reza Khan abdicates to his son. His son, who takes over power, was generally seen as a puppet of the West. And he is met with kind of a lot of opposition among some in Iran. In fact, he does undertake a lot of reforms. When it looks like he is going to be removed from power, the CIA comes in and kind of helps him maintain control. He does undertake a lot of reforms. Women are given the right to vote. He creates a social welfare system, modernizes education. But he does this all with a very authoritarian and oppressive regime. And because of that authoritarian and oppressive regime, and one that is seen as being a puppet of the West and not supportive of Islam in any way, the 1979 Iranian Revolution takes place. There's a lot of great videos on this. If you watch the opening of the movie Persepolis, that's a really great one. And there's a crash course world history on this too, if you want more information. But in 1979, this revolution comes about. Ayatollah Khomeini leads this revolution against the government of Iran. The Shah eventually abdicates. He flees the country. He goes to the United States, which of course proves to the supporters of the Iranian Revolution what a horrible person this puppet government was. And they establish a theocracy, and that is a government led by a religious leader and under, in this case, Sharia law. Or Muslim law. Iran really does become the leading anti-Western, anti-Israel government of the Middle East. Its early relationship with the United States is very rocky. In the revolution, Iran takes American diplomats hostage, and they hold them for something in the neighborhood of like 500 days or maybe even longer than that. I think it's a little over, somewhere around there. It's over a year. Only releasing them after Jimmy Carter leaves the presidency. That may have actually lost Jimmy Carter the presidency in 1980 because he was seen as very weak on this issue because he refused to go to war over this. So the repressive regime in Iran still rules. They're still led by a religious cleric. They have been condemned worldwide on human rights abuses. They've been sanctioned for their nuclear weapons program, but a historic agreement was reached. This is an old PowerPoint that says this past year. That was back when Obama was president. A lot of those, that agreement has largely been abandoned by the current administration of the United States. And here's a little bit of comparison between Iran and Turkey. There's another great video here talking about Iran. So we don't really have time for that. Oh my gosh, let's stop screen sharing because this is going to be really trippy if we don't. Wow. So that is the fastest I can do in talking about Iran and the Iranian Revolution. Hopefully answer your question. We'll go through a few more here. We'll try to do some rapid fire momentarily. Can we go over the Cold War, specifically the proxy wars and the space race? So that's a big question, and we're close to 9 o'clock. So let me just give you the brief rundown. Cold War, predominantly between the United States and Soviet Union, the U.S. and its allies on one side, the Soviet Union and its allies on the other, characterized by organizations like NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And it is a competition over influence and ideology. The U.S., this capitalist idea of democracy they wanted to spread around the world, anti-communism, and on the Soviet side, communist ideology. And so those two things are seen as at odds with one another. This is seen as certainly in Europe, as you have what Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain that separated the idea of an iron curtain, not a literal curtain, that separated Eastern and Western Europe. Even Germany, of course, was split in this way. Major events of the Cold War to know, I would say. Issues surrounding Berlin, the Berlin blockade and airlift, the building of the Berlin Wall in the 1960s. Other major events, closest we came to nuclear war was the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the United States basically quarantined Cuba and blocked the Soviets from sending and placing missiles there, very close to leading to war. Ultimately, the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba if the United States removed them from Turkey. But this war especially was fought through competition, funding of different governments around the world, and funding for different wars. So if we think about proxy wars, whether it be Vietnam, where communists supported there were communist troops supported by the Soviet Union and China, and the United States supported the non-communist troops of South Vietnam, whether it was in Latin American countries where the Soviets supported communist fighters and the United States non-communist fighters, whether it was in Ethiopia when the same thing happened. There are a lot of different wars that are fought around the world in this time period where the United States and Soviet Union are competing for influence in the region. Some countries do not want any part of this Cold War. They become part of what is known as the non-aligned movement. Countries like India are leaders in this non-aligned movement, where they refuse to take either side, either the American side or the Soviet side, in this competition. Some countries are very skillful in playing the two off of each other. Nasser in Egypt is particularly noteworthy for this. He basically used the United States and Soviet Union to get the Aswan High Dam built and funded, and also to ultimately gain control of the Suez Canal, which Nasser had nationalized and taken over from British and French control. The British and French orchestrated basically a war to gain control back, with Israel assisting in that, and the Soviets and the United States eventually forced them to back down, allowing Egypt to retain control of that canal. So that's the big things. This Cold War, of course, is fought on all sorts of fields. It's not just on the battlefield, but it's fought in technological races, fields of education, sports, even. But the most significant is an offshoot of that nuclear arms race, and that is the race to space. The Soviets are the first to put a satellite in space, which kicks off the space race. The U.S. quickly follows suit. The Soviets are the first to put a man into space, Yuri Gagarin, and the U.S. soon follows suit with Alan Shepard. The United States, though, does kind of change the finish line and does become the first to send a man to the moon, to prance around and gather some dirt and things and stick a flag on it. So the space race is seen as kind of that offshoot of Cold War competition, as both sides were trying to prove their superiority, not just intellectually and technologically, but also militarily, right? If you can get a rocket that gets a person to space, you have the capability of sending a nuclear device around the world. All right. Another question, can you go over the falling of the last czar? So in Russia, this could be a good connection to that Cold War, right? How does communism even come about in the Soviet Union? How does the Soviet Union created? In Russia, in the late 19th century, of course, things were pretty difficult. Russia was late to the industrialization party. They abolished serfdom in order to even have the workforce in cities to be able to industrialize. But Russia periodically suffers setbacks. Reforms that could bring Russia into the modern world occasionally are met with traditionalists, conservatives who do not want to move forward. This happens. This is significant. A significant event takes place that really makes this happen when the Tsar of Russia is assassinated by an anarchist, right? So Soviet Union is rather behind, and when World War I breaks out, the Soviet Union simply is just not ready for it. It becomes certainly a devastating war for the Soviets, I guess not yet the Soviets, for the Russians. And the Tsar himself basically becomes the leader of this war. And so people at home are not happy. They want to see the end of this war. Ultimately, the Bolsheviks and other political groups are successful in overthrowing the Tsar in an attempt to end the war and set up a new government that responds to the people. And that occurs in February of 1917. And in its place, a provisional government is set up, a temporary government until the war is over. They're going to manage Russia until the war is over and then find a more permanent solution. But the provisional government does not respond to the will of people to get out of the war, and they continue the war against Germany. And so that leads to a second part of this Russian Revolution, that is the October Revolution in 1917, where the Bolsheviks and the communists seize control of Russia. And Vladimir Lenin takes charge of Russia and negotiates an end to Russia's involvement in World War I, actually ceding a great deal of land and losing a lot of land for Russia in order to exit the war. But this enables him to focus on the struggle for power in Russia. And after the Russian Revolution of 1917, a civil war that lasts 4 to 5 years takes place, with the Bolsheviks eventually coming out on top in 1922, establishing the Soviet Union, as we tend to think of it, or as we call it, Communist Russia. Now, the Tsar himself falls because he just loses support of the people, and he's eventually forced to abdicate the throne. It was not the intention of people who were forced to abdicate to kill them, but extremists who feared that at the end of this crisis, a king might be placed back on the throne, or a member of the Tsar's family might be placed back on the throne, something that may, like, for example, occurred in France in the 1800s. They take the Tsar and his family into a basement and they murder them, effectively ending the long dynasty, Romanov dynasty of Russia. All right, good question. Consequences of McDonaldization. So McDonaldization, or Americanization, whatever term you want to give that, really is in reference to that process of globalization that is occurring around the world and the influence of the United States around the world, and U.S. corporations, companies, and U.S. Or what we might consider to be American culture on the rest of the world. Consequences. A shared global culture, perhaps, is probably the greatest consequence. Now, whether or not that's positive or negative, you would probably have to look case by case. It might be a really great opportunity for like a DBQ on the AP exam to parse through those consequences of globalization, or this process of Americanization, whatever we might want to call it. So that's probably the best answer I can give to that question, without just giving my blatant opinion. Can we go over what we need to know about the Middle East in this time period? All right, so quick hits. I'm gonna have to really do some quick hits in this. I'm gonna actually, I think I can freeze the chat or something. It was telling me earlier. I don't know what I can do. Hallie, you'll be the last question that I answer today. So let's do some real fast stuff here. What do you need to know about the Middle East? One, their role in World War I. Remember, the Ottoman Empire was a major player in World War I. Eventually, it is broken up. The mandate system is created, where basically European nations control large areas, not the entirety of the Middle East, but large areas of the Middle East. Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey maintain their independence. Egypt maintains their independence during that time period after World War I up until post-World War II. Certainly the Middle East has an important role in international relations in the world today, and that is especially due to it being a source of much of the world's oil, which is a very important energy source in our world still today. But beyond that, also in dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. After World War II, Israel was created by the United Nations, eventually declared independence in 1948. It was founded as a homeland for Jews, but that created a lot of displacement of Palestinians in the region and a lot of animosity from surrounding Arab nations who supported Palestinians in the region. And ultimately, what resulted was several wars between Israel, which was backed by the United States, and the surrounding territories. Eventually, Egypt and Israel reached a peace agreement. Later on, Jordan recognized Israel, but there are still several countries, Iran, chief among them, that does not want to see Israel exist as a nation, and they believe it belongs to the Palestinians. Right now, in the world, there's still a lot of disputes about what that region should look like. Some have proposed a two-state solution, a free and independent Palestine and a free and independent Israel. But that is still very highly controversial. So I'll let you do your own research and make your opinions on that. But Israel is still a major and powerful player in the Middle East to this day. So that's kind of the big stuff. Beyond the Israel and the international relations there, and what we've already talked about with Iran, the Middle East in this time period is significant for a whole host of other reasons. Of course, the United States being involved in wars in Iraq in the 1990s and again in the 2000s. Our role in the region is often a popular topic for questions, especially our heightened role in the region since 9/11, when terrorists who were partially funded by people in the Middle East and Afghanistan attacked American buildings, New York City, Washington, D.C., by hijacking airplanes. So the United States has, of course, taken a much larger role in the region. But in the last decade or so, perhaps the biggest news out of the Middle East is the results of pushes for more democratic governments in what was called the Arab Spring, which swept through the Middle East and North Africa in 2010. Citizens pushed for much more involvement in government. In some cases, that was successful. In others, for example, in Syria and Yemen, it has resulted in ongoing civil war. So those are some of the big things to consider. Just an overview. Of course, there are other things that you might want to know about. Certainly, you'll want to know about Pan-Arabism. You'll want to know a little bit about Egypt's role in the Middle East. All right. Does anyone know how long this stream will last? Yeah, probably close to 9:30. We won't go more than 15 more minutes. Answers on our test, it's A, B, C, or D. Is that going to be on the test? I'll say yes, sure. I don't know what's on the AP exam, so that'll be a surprise to me. So just assume it all is. If it's in the key concept, it's fair game for the test. Can we talk about the rise and fall of apartheid? Okay, that's something I can answer really quickly, and you probably don't believe me, but I'll try. The system of apartheid is. I just realized why I'm probably getting very slow. Why the stream is going slow. I have like a million windows open up hidden on my computer. Maybe that'll help the bandwidth. So apartheid is a system that is put in place in South Africa. Now, keep in mind with South Africa, it was settled. It's on the southern tip of Africa. Certainly, there are native Black Africans there, but then, beginning in the 1600s, it was settled by Dutch settlers, and then later on, it was settled by the British. And so, certainly, there were some conflicts. That's from our last unit. Won't talk about that. But part of the agreement after the Boer Wars fought between like the British and the Dutch settlers there was that the whites in South Africa would be given preference and better treatment than Black South Africans. And the system of apartheid was eventually set up, which codified basically in law a system of segregation, which gave the minority population, the white population of South Africa, control over government. And certainly those people who were in charge were better off economically. And so And South Africa is given its independence in like 1910 or something like that, pretty early on for African decolonization. I think it's like one of the first countries, probably maybe the first country given its independence by a European colonial power. And but that system of apartheid, that racially that legalized racial segregation and mistreatment of Black South Africans, basically stays in place until the 1990s. The movement against apartheid was led by Nelson Mandela, who was the leader of the African National Congress, not to be confused with the Indian National Congress, but you can kind of think of its role in much the same way, advocating for the rights of Black South Africans. Nelson Mandela was thrown in jail, was in jail for something like 27 years, eventually is freed as a guy named F.W. de Klerk, who was eventually who was the president of South Africa, began to negotiate the end to apartheid and began dismantling the system of apartheid. And that was under very heavy international pressure. People around the world, especially Western countries, put a great deal of pressure and sanctions on South Africa, making them basically outcasts in the world community until they finally agreed to dismantle that program. And they did so, holding free elections for the first time, I think, in 1994. And that is when Nelson Mandela was elected to be the first Black president of South Africa. And I believe they've only had Black presidents since, because that is the majority population there. So that's kind of the overview of apartheid. And I love how some of y'all are putting some answers in here in the chat. That's really great, because I know it took me a long time to get to that question that was asked a long time ago. All right, last question. And then let me just say to William, y'all have already taken your period 6 test. That's okay. My students have already taken their DBQ for theirs before we went on spring break. We were just delayed a little bit. Hopefully this will help you in your review for the AP exam. Maybe working backwards to the exam. Do we need to know specifics regarding the conflicts in Key Concept 6.2? So here's what I would say. For Key Concept 6.2, there are a lot of conflicts. Obviously, World Wars I and II. We actually I started with that in a brief overview of those. I think that was maybe the first question that we went over tonight, or one of the first couple questions that we talked about, thinking about the trends of this time period. So yes, you do need to know general specifics, causes and outcomes of these major global wars. I would say this: read through Key Concept 6.2. Make sure that you understand that land-based empires in this time period were collapsing. Ottomans, the Ching Empire, even the Russian Empire fall in favor of the rise of Turkey and the Soviet Union, and first nationalist China, later communist China. And that's because of internal and external factors, whether it be wars, dealing with European incursions, and then also unrest within the country. Make sure that you understand what, the variety of ways decolonization took place, right? Some through negotiation, some through armed struggle. In general, you don't have to know the details of everything dealing with that, but you should know some examples of people of countries that had armed struggle for independence and countries that negotiated their independence. And that theme of decolonization is very important in this time period. So make sure that you recognize the ideologies of anti-imperialism, perhaps some of the leaders like Mohandas Gandhi, Ho Chi Minh, Kwame Nkrumah, who fought for independence. So I would say that's kind of the big stuff to know in terms of the conflicts in this time period. Also covered in Key Concept 6.2 is genocide and ethnic violence. So in terms of major conflicts, you do need to know certainly about the Holocaust, but you also should know some other examples of atrocities committed and genocide committed. The Armenian genocide in Turkey during World War I, the Cambodian genocide in the 1970s, the genocide in Rwanda is another example that comes up often from the 1990s. So those are examples of ethnic violence that also were kind of offshoots of other conflicts or set up by other things, whether it be decolonization or world wars, or struggles between different ethnic groups in countries who were fighting for control. So I would say, that's the big stuff. And then just what we started with some of the trends earlier when I started this, the trends of World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, I think, are also important to know. All right, that is kind of most of the questions that I'm sorry I'm not answering that last one too specifically. I will say that if you're confused on anything with Key Concept 6.2, go to Freemanpedia, look at his one pager on 6.2. If there's anything you don't know from that, go to your review packet that went along with my Key Concept 6.2 review video and look there. If it's not answered there, or if it's not on there, it's probably not on the test. I think that's pretty much it. We've gone for about an hour and 15 minutes, which is a little longer than I anticipated, but just had some really good questions and some really big questions tonight. So I love when people are thinking about big trends. I had a great question about trends in China and trends in Russia today. So I like seeing those questions because remember, AP World History is a course about trends. Yes, you need to know examples of all these things, but sometimes I get a little worried when we get bogged down into the exact dates of something or the names of individual people. Oftentimes those are given to you on the test in readings or in questions, and it's your responsibility to identify the greater significance of those people. So that's all about trends in this time period. All right. So I'm going to basically close it up now. I think that's everything anyways that I have for you. I had a window open and apparently I've lost it. Oh, here it is. I was looking for this chat to be able to turn it off. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask me tomorrow. I'll be around. If you go to our school, of course, you can find me in Gallery 1 at lunch and ask me any questions you have at the last minute. Other than that, I hope you have a great night. Get a good night's sleep and eat breakfast. And I'm sure you'll do great on the test. For those who are not my students, thank you for joining us. Take a look at our videos on here. And feel free to leave any comments. Like, subscribe, of course. We're almost at 1,700 subscribers. We're so YouTube famous. I will see you later on as we study for the AP exam. Have a good night.